The mother of a murdered woman whose killer was finally convicted last week after a two-decade-long fight for justice is calling for a public inquiry into the mishandling of the case. Iain Packer was jailed for life on Wednesday for the murder of Emma Caldwell back in 2005, as well as for 11 rapes and 21 further charges, including sexual assaults and abduction. It emerged during the trial that Packer had been accused of rape and violent attacks on dozens of women, going back as far as 1990, but police had failed to act. Margaret Caldwell met with the First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf, today. The family lawyer gave this update after that meeting.
The First Minister promised that he will give primary consideration to the family's demands for a statutory public inquiry, and the Justice Secretary, Angela Constance, promised she will update Parliament within days on their decision. Since the murder of Emma in 2005, many in the police will argue things have changed significantly. We do not accept this. In 2023, Sir Ian Livingstone, whilst Chief Constable of Police Scotland, spoke of the misogyny within the police service. We know that evidence exists that the abduction, rape and murder of Emma Caldwell and the subsequent rapes of women might have been prevented or at least disrupted had allegations against Packer been properly investigated.
And joining me now in the studio, former Met Police Detective Peter Bleksley. Down the line, we're joined by the lawyer Nick Freeman. Thank you both very much for joining me. I think we'll just prevail upon Peter to tell the tragic and terrible story of the murder of Emma Caldwell and how this could have come about.
Yes, very sadly, Emma's life kind of fell apart when she lost her sister to cancer. And Emma really struggled to deal with that. And there were drug issues in her life. And in her later years, she worked in the sex industry. And tragically, her body was found in Woodland, some 44 miles from Glasgow, when she was just 27 years old and she'd been murdered. So, of course, a police inquiry was launched. And really surprisingly for me, bearing in mind that this is only 2005, so relatively modern era of policing we're talking about, the inquiry team became fixated on 4 Turkish men who ran a restaurant. And I've heard from very reliable inside sources that this fixation that these men had to be responsible for Emma's murder was unshakable, and other voices would not be listened to. And they were eventually charged, those men, and of course, quite rightfully, the case was kicked out of court. Only some years later, after a lot of pressure by the media, including the BBC and Margaret, Emma's mother, did the police do a thorough reinvestigation. And of course, it turned out that Iain Packer was responsible not only for Emma's murder, but over 20 rapes. And another dozen women gave evidence at his very recent trial that only finished last week. So the buzzword here, I think, is incompetence. And not surprisingly, the family want answers.
Let me bring Nick Freeman into this. It's almost unbelievable that something like this should happen. What do you make of what Peter says about this fixation with these particular Turkish men? Are you aware of other cases, Nick, where that kind of thing happens? The police are convinced it's X and actually it isn't at all, it's Y?
Not to this extent. I mean, this is staggering incompetence, because when you look at the boots on the ground and the investigating officers, you know, that they were told initially by Packer, you know, I don't go with prostitutes. They had 9 statements from women who said, yes, it's him. He's either raped me, he's sexually assaulted me, he's done it in woods. And the officers, particularly 2 of the detectives, were imploring their senior officer to allow them to arrest. And Packer himself, initially, in his 4th statement in August 2006, he admitted taking Emma to the woods where her body was later found and paying her for sex. And staggeringly, this senior officer who left the force the following year in 2006 refused to allow them to go anywhere near Packer. He wasn't allowed to, he didn't allow them to arrest him. Now, he retired in 2006. He's declined to make a comment. There's been an investigation against him, I understand, in terms of police misconduct in public office, and the investigating team found insufficient evidence. But to answer your question, to have such myopic thinking, blinded thinking against a massive weight of evidence, it's just staggering. You think, well, that there must be something else going on other than incompetence here, because it just doesn't make sense. And tragically, of course, many other women who were raped and sexually assaulted since, because of the police incompetence and the fact that this man was not put away when he should have been. And I think, had it not been for the pressure of the media and the sort of arrogance that Packer had, that he wanted to clear his name and volunteered himself for a couple of interviews, he may never have been brought to justice. So I think absolutely there should be a public inquiry. I'm quite confident there will be. I'm not so confident there will be a criminal investigation, because that's a very difficult matter to prove, and there already has been one, and I'm not sure there's any fresh evidence that would justify more taxpayers' money being expended.
Peter, the female journalist who was granted an interview by Packer, who was saying he wanted to, proclaim his innocence, clear his name, and everything else, ended up doing the precise opposite. I mean, she sounded as if she was absolutely shocked, really, by the way in which he served himself up on a platter, and felt very much that if she, a young female journalist, could uncover this, then how much more likely would it have been for senior seasoned police officers to unpick this years before?
Yeah, well, we do know, of course, what a perverse mind Packer has. And perhaps there was some element of control or coercion over a female journalist. We may simply never know. Nick picks up on misconduct in public office. And there's a little known point about that specific offence, which can be incredibly difficult to prove. But unlike most criminal offences, with that particular charge, doing nothing can be a criminal offence. For example, you're a public servant, you should execute your duty. If you don't, that can be misconduct. So actually you can get convicted for not doing anything when you should have done something.
Yeah.
Of course, Nick correctly points out that one investigation didn't gather sufficient evidence. Will there be any likelihood of another one? We won't see. But of course, a judge-led public inquiry, which may be announced, we'll have to see what the Justice Secretary of Scotland says, could compel witnesses to court, could compel them to get into the witness box, and who knows what evidence that might turn up.
Nick, we very often hear the phrase lessons must be learned, lessons will be learned, they shall have been learned. All too often we then find a matter of a few months or years later, nothing has been learned at all. But if there were anything to be learned from this very sad case, the dogged persistence of Emma's mother and the chronic incompetence of the police over this, what are the lessons that should be learned, would you say?
Well, I think the investigating officers, had they been left to their own instincts, would have brought this man to justice very much sooner. The lessons to be learned, to answer your question, is I don't know what Johnson's explanation was for refusing to allow these officers who were aware of all the evidence, and there was a massive amount of evidence against Packer, from arresting him. He just was simply obsessed with these 4 Turkish guys. So I suppose the answer is it shouldn't rest solely on one officer, and there needs to be more of a collaboration with officers before a decision like this is made, particularly when you think these 4 Turkish guys, that there was a massive amount of taxpayers' money expended in covert microphones put in the houses. They were listened to. There was just nothing there to support it. So this blind obsession with them by one officer made no sense, and that should never be allowed to happen again. And I doubt really whether it would be allowed to happen again. I think there is a more collaborative approach in the police force. More officers are involved, and if something like this was happening, I think you'd probably have a whistleblower contacting the media and saying, "Look, you need to look at this. Something's not right here." And we live in an age where there's more of an open invitation for people who are unhappy with what's happening to come forward and speak about it, and they have protection when they do so.
And Peter, the police chief who refused to allow them to examine the situation and refused to allow Packer really to be pursued in any way, that he doesn't have to account for that. He doesn't have to be brought to book in any way. That's just water under the bridge, is it?
Well, this is exactly the kind of situation that causes so much frustration when there is police wrongdoing or incompetence, because we don't see accountability. We see senior police officers sometimes going off to a palace or a castle to get their gong, leaving the police service with their gilt-edged pensions, and no one is ever held accountable. But there's one very big lesson to be learnt from this case, if I may.
Please.
And it applies to every investigator in any way, shape or form. If people want to think about the Horizon IT and the post office, it's very applicable there. These kind of issues arise when people search for proof. What all investigators What all investigators must tirelessly and always do is search for truth, not proof.
Oh my gosh, thank you very much. I think we should all write an essay on that one. Truth, not proof. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, Nick. Always a pleasure to have you on the programme. Thank you very much indeed.